In the Pokemon TCG, retreating has been a key mechanic of the game since day one. By paying an energy cost that varies from card to card, you can switch that Pokemon with one of your benched Pokemon, but you can only do this once per turn. Retreating is so important in the Pokemon trading card game that cards which make retreating easier always see competitive success. I mean, this Pheromosa card was literally only used because of its free retreat cost and high HP on a basic Pokemon. And despite not doing damage or literally anything else, it's one of the most notable cards from its expansion. But what happens when retreating is off the table for you? Well, now your attackers can't pivot and your support Pokemon and liabilities on the bench can get trapped in the active spot. Retreat locking or trapping strategies are some of the most broken strategies in the competitive Pokemon TCG. This is because each deck can only play so many outs to a retreat lock, yet they usually need some liability Pokemon in play to function optimally. Cards like Yveltal from Mega Evolution and Ethan's Sudowoodo from Destined Rivals are the most prevalent retreat lockers in Standard right now and see high-level tournament success in their own archetypes. But these cards, despite being good, actually represent how retreat lockers have changed in recent years to where these Pokemon are way worse than what we had before. So today I'm here to break down permanent retreat locks in the Pokemon trading card game, why they're so broken, and why they've effectively been removed from the game. And honestly, I think if you stick around, you're going to learn at least one new thing about the Pokemon TCG. Without further ado, let's get into it. Please subscribe if you enjoy the video, of course, and yeah, let's go. Retreating has of course existed since day one of the game, but a way to prevent the opponent from retreating didn't exist until this Snorlax card was printed in 2002 with the iconic block ability. This ability states that as long as Snorlax is your active Pokemon, the defending Pokemon can't retreat, so long as Snorlax isn't affected by a special condition. Functionally, this means if you just never attack and pass with Snorlax active every turn, the opponent may never be able to manually retreat their active Pokemon the entire game. However, this doesn't mean they're stuck there forever, as they can rely on cards like Switch or Warp Point to get them out of the lock. However, this block Snorlax wasn't actually that good competitively, largely due to limited options for consistently trapping liability Pokemon in the active spot. However, as time went on, Pokemon seemed to become more and more scarce with printing permanent retreat lock effects on cards, at least at first. They printed this Pidgey card with a clutch attack that evolved into a pretty good Pidgeot, but besides that and some other mostly bad cards, permanent retreat lock was hard to find in Standard for a while. In the entire Black and White era, only one permanent retreat lock card was printed, being funnily enough another block Snorlax. But not the second one, no, this was the third block Snorlax, because another block Snorlax was printed in the Diamond and Pearl era. However, this one was actually by far the second best block Snorlax card ever printed, being a strong meta call at a few expanded format major tournaments during its peak. Don't worry though, we'll be getting to the fourth block Snorlax in a little bit. While retreat locking strategies were still cool to have access to in the Black and White era, there were a few big problems. First, lots of decks played multiple switching cards or at least one copy of Keldeo EX, a Pokemon who switches itself to the active spot from the bench and can attack for any colorless energy, meaning trapping it was pretty tough. Keldeo existing and being a good card alone made retreat lock strategies pretty terrible unless you could set up a combo to permalock a Keldeo. However, this didn't really exist outside of paralysis lock decks like Gothitelle Excelgor, so this really made retreat locking pretty bad. So for the 5th generation of Pokemon, retreat locking strategies were not great because of the metagame around it and not necessarily because the mechanics sucked. And X and Y wasn't too great to permanent retreat locking either, as only one card had a permanent retreat lock attack, and it was on Clawitzer Break, which is effectively a stage 2 Pokemon that evolves from a card that isn't even that good in the first place. However, Sun and Moon perfectly illustrated why retreat lock is so broken. Guardians Rising added Rockruff, which is a basic pre-evolution Pokemon with a permanent retreat lock attack for 1 fighting energy. It of course evolved into Lycanroc GX, which is one of the greatest Sun and Moon era cards ever. Its ability Bloodthirsty Eyes is basically like a free boss's orders on an ability, and its GX attack was very strong for 2 energy, able to one-shot a lot of Pokemon. With Lycanroc being very strong in Buzzwole GX decks and other archetypes as well, this Rockruff was clearly the optimal choice, and versus some decks it could win you the game instantly by trapping a liability. For example, versus the main Vileplume deck, which was Turbo Vespiquen, Rockruff could trap their Vileplume in the active spot, and since they didn't play many grass energy, if Vileplume couldn't find or didn't play Olympia, then they would lose the game to Rockruff. However, the set right after Guardians Rising would pretty much kill retreat locking strategies for the next 2 years, as this set was where Guzma was released. If you're familiar with Prime Catcher in Standard right now, one of the greatest cards ever in its own right, it's basically just that effect but on a supporter card that you could play at 4 copies in your deck. Needless to say, with literally every deck playing at least one Guzma, strategies built around retreat locking never really took off. However, at the end of the Sun and Moon era, there was some niche usage of this Dewpider card that perma retreat locks, mainly because the Araquanid it evolved into has a great ability walling out fire decks. However, it was really the end of the Sword and Shield era that retreat lock strategies went from pretty bad to some of the best in the game. Block Snorlax was printed for the 4th time in the Pokemon Go expansion, and with its iconic ability, all it really needed was the right support to work. Echoing Horn already existed and was a great card in normal decks, but especially good in a Snorlax deck since you could get liabilities from your opponent's discard pile into play. It also had access to Avery to force your opponent to discard bench Pokemon until they have 3 remaining while drawing 3 cards as a bonus. This made it so if your opponent had filled their bench with a ton of attacking Pokemon, you could use Avery to free up bench space to connect an Echoing Horn. Peonia helped a lot with prize card variants, and cards like Sydney and Misfortune Sisters could attack your opponent's deck, be disruptive, and provide more depth to strategy. But it was really 151 and Paradox Rift in the Scarlet and Violet era that sealed the deal. 151 added Erica's Invitation, which is a card that looks like it was made just for Snorlax. It's a supporter card that reveals your opponent's hand when played, benches a basic Pokemon you find there, and then switches it into the active spot all at once. Now the opponent's liabilities weren't safe in the discard pile or in their hand, and the item card lore module from Pokemon Go now became super useful. This item card forces both players to put any Pokemon from the top 3 cards of their deck into their hand and reveal them. This card was pretty terrible in normal decks because there's really no reason to help your opponent out like that when you could just play Ultra Ball to get a Pokemon from your deck and not just from the top 3 cards anyway. But by forcing Pokemon into your opponent's hand from the top 3 of their deck, this meant Erica was way more deadly. But honestly, Paradox Rift's reprint of Counter Catcher, an item-based boss's orders that only works when behind on prize cards, was what truly made Snorlax Stall a tier 1 archetype. Now you could gust up liabilities and play a supporter on the same turn, either Arven to search out that same counter catcher, or play something like Misfortune Sisters to mill switching cards, just to name a few. Giacomo, a supporter card from Paldea Evolved that discards 1 special energy from each of your opponent's Pokemon, is some of the best energy discard on a trainer card ever printed. Sydney discards up to 2 special energy, stadiums, or tools from your opponent's hand, and Temple of Sinnoh is a stadium card that disables the secondary effects of all special energy. This combo worked perfectly to counter the main Jet Energy deck, Lugia. Jet Energy is an energy card that when it's attached to a benched Pokemon switches it to the active spot, which is obviously pretty bad for a stall deck like Snorlax. However, Sydney could mill special energies from your opponent's hand, and Giacomo could slow the opponent down by getting rid of their energy on board. The deck had so many options and also access to infinite resources thanks to Silene. Silene flips 2 coins and puts any card from the discard on top of your deck for each head. This means that on average you will put 1 card on top. The card almost always chosen with this is Palpad, an item card that shuffles 2 supporters from the discard into your deck, meaning you could use Silene to get a Palpad back, Silene back, Palpad, and another supporter, and usually loop from there. Snorlax won 2 regional championships as a standalone deck, and won even more tournaments in control decks built around Pidgeot. Blocklax was a staple of the metagame from November 2023 until the day it rotated, and it has cemented itself as arguably the 2nd greatest retreat lock card ever, but maybe not the first. as Mawile from Lost Origin is possibly the most influential card in this video. Tempting Trap costs 1 colorless energy and retreat locks the opponent for 0 damage. With 90 HP, it was not particularly frail for a retreat lock attacker, and this made it the best retreat lock attacker in the game, possibly the best of all time. Mawile saw play in just about every archetype in its time in Standard, from Charizard EX to Pidgeot Control to Gardevoir EX to Lost Zone Toolbox to even Snorlax stall itself. Mawile was a staple of every meta game it was legal for because of how quickly it could run away with the game. The Scarlet and Violet era was absolutely full of bench-sitting liabilities that were there to patch matchups or boost consistency. Cards like Jirachi, Manaphy, Lumineon V, and Rotom V come to mind, but there were many more like Latias EX, Squawkabilly EX, Radiant Greninja, and even Radiant Charizard. All of these cards could become total liabilities if they were trapped in the active spot and hit with Tempting Trap due to either impractical attack costs or negligible damage output. It felt like every deck played at least one of these cards in them, so Mawile and by proxy Snorlax could exploit the weaknesses of the metagame at just the right time. Mawile's surprise factor also made it potent in decks that weren't known for playing it. For example, Gardevoir only really started playing the card around late 2024 to 2025, and during this time and slightly before it, countless players would lose to Mawile because they didn't expect it and then ended up benching something like Manaphy. It sucks because if you didn't bench Manaphy, then Screamtail could easily snipe your bench Pokemon, but if you did, then Mawile could trap it and stall the opponent a bunch of time. Mawile is without a doubt one of the most frustrating cards to lose to because it's sometimes so impossible to see it coming with closed deck lists. No normal opponent would always expect their opponent to pivot from charging up Radiant Greninja to snipe your bench to instead going and bossing your Manaphy and using Mawile to trap it. If you don't study deck lists copiously, and even if you do, Mawile can easily steal a game from the palm of your hands because of how powerful its splashable permanent retreat lock is. Once Mawile and Snorlax rotated in 2025, there was one permanent retreat lock card in Standard, and it was a Stage 2 fossil Pokemon. Need I say more? As such, permanent retreat lock has been all but removed from the Pokemon TCG in 2026. The closest we have today are fighting types like Ethan, Sudowoodo, and Nacli, because most liability Pokemon actually resist fighting, meaning that they do 0 damage when hitting for resistance. When Retreat Lock does 0 damage, it puts on immense deck out pressure and forces a switching card to be used, otherwise the Pokemon can get trapped forever. By doing damage, however, you can end up knocking out the liability instead of trapping it, and that exchange usually favors the player getting trapped since they can refresh their deck with a card like Iono or Lily's Determination and then wait for a liability to get knocked out. This is why cards like Snorlax and Mawile are much preferred over cards like Sudowoodo because they do no damage. Sudowoodo in Standard is currently one of the best because Pokemon like the ever-present Monkey Dory and other liabilities like Squawkabilly, Latias, and Noctowl all can be turned into game-losing situations by a Sudowoodo because of their resistance. However, at the end of the day, Sudowoodo is no Mawile, just as Omastar isn't even close to Snorlax. With cards like Professor Turo's Scenario and Penny rotating very soon, Retreat Lock gets a whole lot better post-rotation since you can't easily remove liabilities from play. Pokemon likely knows this and is purposely holding off on printing a permanent Retreat Lock card for that exact reason, the lack of counterplay. Although we do lose Erica to rotation, we still keep the powerful accompanying Flute item card from Twilight Masquerade. This is an item card that reveals the top 5 cards of the opponent's deck and forces any of the basic Pokemon you want there onto their bench. Flute plus limited outs to break a lock means that Retreat Lock, if permanent on every Pokemon in the game, would likely break it. Retreat Locking is so fundamentally broken in the Pokemon trading card game because it limits your opponent's options and ability to react to your strategy. And depending on the meta that you're playing in, it can even restrict their deck building. If you don't have enough answers to Retreat Lock, then you're gonna lose the common matchup most of the time, but by allocating too many resources to it, you make your deck worse overall. Block Snorlax was actually really easy to beat if you wanted to. By playing 4 Turo and 4 Penny in your deck, you're easily going to win that matchup most of the time, but of course no good and consistent deck plays ridiculous counts like that just for Snorlax. Instead, decks like Mega Absol Box today have good reason to run mobility cards like Petron EX and Penny because it makes their deck better in the first place. If you don't want to lose the game to a stray Mawile, you can do that, but just know that your deck's consistency and other matchups just got a little bit worse by building your deck to counter one card. In metas where Retreat Lock isn't respected enough, it can demolish the competition like the Stockholm Regionals meta in 2024. But when it's prepared for beforehand, it falls off a cliff completely. In metas where everyone's on Guzma or Keldeo EX, Retreat Lock really isn't good. But when every deck plays 2 or more liabilities and at most a handful of one-time outs to a Retreat Lock, then it can win regionals. Basically, if there are ever cards like Accompanying Flute, Erica's Invitation, or Echoing Horn in Standard, then permanent Retreat Lock cards like Snorlax can get out of hand. And Counter Catcher is really just the nail in the coffin for it. So as long as it's easy to exploit, Pokemon will probably not bring back its most broken mechanic anytime soon. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing to the channel as it would mean the world to me. Let me know in the comments what you think about Retreat Locks in the Pokemon trading card game. And anyways, take care. Have a good one. Bye.